The Jewels by Guy de Maupassant. Translated by Robert Collet. Read by Michael Monette. Monsieur Lanton had met the girl at a party given one evening by his office superior, and love had caught him in its net. She was the daughter of a country tax collector who had died a few years before. She had come to Paris then with her mother, who struck up an acquaintance with a few middle-class families in her district, in the hope of marrying her off. They were poor, decent, quiet, and gentle. The girl seemed the perfect example of the virtuous woman to whom every sensible young man dreams of entrusting his life. Her simple beauty had a modest, angelic charm, and the imperceptible smile which always hovered about her lips seemed to be a reflection of her heart. Everybody sang her praises, and people knew her never tired of saying, "Happy the man who marries her. Nobody could find a better wife." Monsieur Lanton, who was then a senior clerk at the Ministry of the Interior, with a salary of 3,500 francs a year, proposed to her and married her. He was incredibly happy with her. She ran his household so skillfully and economically that they gave the impression of living in luxury. She lavished attention on her husband, spoiling and coddling him, and the charm of her person was so great that 6 years after their first meeting he loved her even more than in the early days. He found fault with only 2 of her tastes, her love for the theater and her passion for imitation jewelry. Her friends, she knew the wives of a few petty officials, often obtained a box at the theater for her for popular plays, and even for first nights, and she dragged her husband along willy-nilly to these entertainments, which he found terribly tiring after a day's work at the office. He therefore begged her to go to the theater with some lady of her acquaintance, who would bring her home afterwards. It was a long time before she gave in, as she thought that this arrangement was not quite respectable. But finally, just to please him, she agreed, and he was terribly grateful to her. Now, this love for the theater soon aroused in her a desire to adorn her person. True, her dresses remained very simple, always in good taste but unpretentious, and her gentle grace, her irresistible, humble, smiling charm, seemed to be enhanced by the simplicity of her gowns. But she took to wearing 2 big rhinestone earrings, which sparkled like diamonds, and she also wore necklaces of fake pearls, bracelets of imitation gold, and combs set with colored glass cut to look like real stones. Her husband, who was rather shocked by this love of show, often used to say, "My dear, when a woman can't afford to buy real jewels, she ought to appear adorned with her beauty and grace alone. Those are still the rarest of gems." But she would smile sweetly and reply, "I can't help it. I like imitation jewelry. It's my only vice. I know you are right, but people can't change their natures. I would have loved to have owned some real jewels." Then she would run the pearl necklaces through her fingers and make the cut glass gems flash in the light, saying, "Look, aren't they beautifully made? Anyone would swear they were real." He would smile and say, "You have the taste of a gypsy." Sometimes in the evening, when they were sitting together by the fireside, she would place on the tea table the leather box in which she kept her trash, as Monsieur Lanton called it. Then she would start examining these imitation jewels with passionate attention, as if she were enjoying some deep and secret pleasure, and she would insist on hanging a necklace around her husband's neck, laughing uproariously and crying, "How funny you look!" And then she would throw herself into his arms and kiss him passionately. One night in winter, when she had been to the opera, she came home shivering with cold. The next morning she had a cough, and a week later she died of pneumonia. Lanton very nearly followed her to the grave. His despair was so terrible that his hair turned white within a month. He wept from morning to night, his heart ravaged by unbearable grief, haunted by the memory, the smile, the voice, the every charm of his dead wife. Time did nothing to assuage his grief. Often during office hours, when his colleagues came along to chat about the topics of the day, his cheeks would suddenly puff out, his nose wrinkle up, his eyes fill with tears, and with a terrible grimace he would burst out sobbing. He had left his wife's room untouched, and every day would shut himself in it and think about her. All the furniture and even her clothes remained exactly where they had been on the day she had died. But life soon became a struggle for him. His income, which in his wife's hands had covered all their expenses, was now no longer sufficient for him on his own, and he wondered in amazement how she had managed to provide him with excellent wines and rare delicacies, which he could no longer afford on his modest salary. He incurred a few debts, and ran after money in the way people do when they are reduced to desperate shifts. Finally, one morning, finding himself without a sou a whole week before the end of the month, he decided to sell something, and immediately the idea occurred to him of disposing of his wife's trash. He still harbored a sort of secret grudge against those false gems which had irritated him in the past, and indeed the sight of them every day somewhat spoiled the memory of his beloved. He rummaged for a long time among the heap of gaudy trinkets she had left behind, for she had stubbornly gone on buying jewelry until the last days of her life, bringing home a new piece almost every evening. At last, he decided on the large necklace, which she had seemed to like best, and which, he thought, might well be worth 6 or 7 francs, for it was beautifully made for a piece of paste. He put it in his pocket and set off for his ministry, following the boulevards and looking for a jeweler's shop, which inspired confidence. At last he spotted one and went in, feeling a little ashamed of exposing his poverty in this way, and of trying to sell such a worthless article. "Monsieur," he said to the jeweler, "I would like to know what you think this piece is worth." The man took the necklace, examined it, turned it over, weighed it, inspected it with a magnifying glass, called his assistant, made a few remarks to him in an undertone, placed the necklace on the counter and looked at it from a distance to gauge the effect. Monsieur Lanton, embarrassed by all this ritual, was opening his mouth to say, "Oh, I know perfectly well that it isn't worth anything," when the jeweler said, "Monsieur, this necklace is worth between 12 and 15,000 francs, but I couldn't buy it unless you had told me where it came from." The widower opened his eyes wide and stood there gaping, unable to understand what the jeweler had said. Finally, he stammered, "What was that you said? Are you sure?" The other misunderstood his astonishment and said curtly, "You can go somewhere else and see if they'll offer you more. In my opinion, it's worth 15,000 at the most. Come back and see me if you can't find a better price." Completely dumbfounded, Monsieur Lanton took back his necklace and left the shop, in obedience to a vague desire to be alone and to think. Once outside, however, he felt an impulse to laugh, and he thought, "The fool! Oh, the fool! But what if I'd taken him at his word? Well, there's a jeweler who can't tell real diamonds from paste." And he went into another jeweler's shop at the beginning of the Rue de la Paix. As soon as he saw the necklace, the jeweler exclaimed, "Why, I know that necklace well. It was bought here." Monsieur Lanton asked in amazement, "Oh, how much is it worth?" "Monsieur, I sold it for 25,000. I am prepared to buy it back for 18,000. Once you have told me, in accordance with the legal requirements, how you came to be in possession of it." This time, Monsieur Lanton was dumbfounded. He sat down and said, But, examine it carefully, monsieur. Until now I thought it was paste." "Will you give me your name, monsieur?" said the jeweler. "Certainly. My name's Lanton. I'm an official at the Ministry of the Interior, and I live at number 16, Rue de Martyrs." The jeweler opened his books, looked for the entry, and said, "Yes, this necklace was sent to Madame Lanton's address, number 16, Rue de Martyrs, on the 20th of July, 1876. The two men looked into each other's eyes, the clerk speechless with astonishment, the jeweler scenting a thief. Finally, the latter said, "Will you leave the necklace with me for 24 hours? I'll give you a receipt." "Why, certainly," stammered Monsieur Lanton, and he went out folding the piece of paper which he put in his pocket. Then he crossed the street, walked up it again, noticed that he was going the wrong way, went back as far as the Tuileries, crossed the Seine, realized that he had gone wrong again, and returned to the Champs-Élysées, his mind a complete blank. He tried to think it out, to understand. His wife couldn't have afforded to buy something so valuable, that was certain. But in that case, it was a present. A present! But a present from whom? And why was it given her? He halted in his tracks and remained standing in the middle of the avenue. A horrible doubt crossed his mind. Her? But in that case, all the other jewels were presents too. The earth seemed to be trembling under his feet, and a tree in front of him to be falling. He threw up his arms and fell to the ground unconscious. He came to his senses in a chemist's shop, into which the passers-by had carried him. He took a cab home and shut himself up. He wept bitterly until nightfall, biting on a handkerchief so as not to cry out. Then he went to bed, worn out with grief and fatigue, and slept like a log. A ray of sunlight awoke him, and he slowly got up to go to his ministry. It was hard to think of working after such a series of shocks. It occurred to him that he could ask to be excused, and he wrote a letter to his superior. Then he remembered that he had to go back to the jeweler's, and he blushed with shame. He spent a long time thinking it over, but decided that he could not leave the necklace with that man. So he dressed and went out. It was a fine day, and the city seemed to be smiling under the clear blue sky. People were strolling about the streets with their hands in their pockets. Watching them, Lanton said to himself, "How lucky rich people are! With money, you can forget even the deepest of sorrows. You can go where you like, travel, enjoy yourself. Oh, if only I were rich!" He began to feel hungry, for he had eaten nothing for 2 days, but his pocket was empty. Then he remembered the necklace. 18,000 francs! 18,000 francs! Well, that was a tidy sum, and no mistake. When he reached the Rue de la Paix, he started walking up and down the pavement opposite the jeweler's shop. 18,000 francs! A score of times he almost went in, but every time shame held him back. He was hungry, though, very hungry, and he had no money at all. He quickly made up his mind, ran across the street so as not to have any time to think, and rushed into the shop. As soon as he saw him, the jeweler came forward and offered him a chair with smiling politeness. His assistants came into the shop, too, and glanced surreptitiously at Lanton, with laughter in their eyes and on their lips. "I have made inquiries, monsieur," said the jeweler, "and if you still wish to sell the necklace, I am prepared to pay you the price I offered you." "Why, certainly," stammered the clerk. The jeweler took 18 large banknotes out of a drawer, counted them, and handed them to Lanton, who signed a little receipt and with a trembling hand put the money in his pocket. Then, as he was about to leave the shop, he turned toward the jeweler, who was still smiling, and, lowering his eyes, said, I have some other jewels which have come to me from the same legacy. Would you care to buy them from me too?" The jeweler bowed. "Certainly, monsieur." One of the assistants went out, unable to contain his laughter. Another blew his nose loudly. Lanton, red-faced and solemn, remained unmoved. "I will bring them to you," he said, and he took a cab to go and fetch the jewels. When he returned to the shop an hour later, he still had had nothing to eat. The jeweler and his assistants began examining the jewels one by one, estimating the value of each piece. Almost all of them had been bought at that shop. Lanton now began arguing about the valuations, lost his temper, insisted on seeing the sales registers, and spoke more and more loudly as the sum increased. The large diamond earrings were worth 20,000 francs, the bracelets 35,000, The brooches, rings, and lockets, 16,000. A set of emeralds and sapphires, 14,000. And a solitaire pendant on a gold chain, 40,000, making a total sum of 196,000 francs. The jeweler remarked jokingly, "These obviously belong to a lady who invested all her savings in jewelry." Lanton replied seriously, "It's as good a way as any of investing one's money." And he went off after arranging with the jeweler to have a second expert valuation the next day. Out in the street, he looked at the Vendôme column and felt tempted to climb up it as if it were a greasy pole. He felt light enough to play leapfrog with the statue of the emperor perched up there in the sky. He went to Voisin's for lunch and ordered wine with his meal at 20 francs a bottle. Then he took a cab and went for a drive in the Bois. He looked at the other carriages with a slightly contemptuous air, longing to call out to the passer-by, "I'm a rich man too. I'm worth 200,000 francs. Suddenly, he remembered his ministry and drove there at once, strode into his superior's office and said, "Monsieur, I've come to resign my post. I have just been left 300,000 francs. He shook hands with his former colleagues and told them some of his plans for the future. Then he went off to dine at the Café Anglais. Finding himself next to a distinguished-looking gentleman, he was unable to refrain from informing him with a certain coyness that he had just inherited 400,000 francs. For the first time in his life, he was not bored at the theater, and he spent the night with some prostitutes. 6 months later, he married again. His second wife was a very virtuous woman, but extremely bad-tempered. She made him very unhappy. This has been The Jewels by Guy de Maupassant, read by Michael Monette.